Is figurative painting dead? Surely this expression is kind of excessive, maybe on purpose. I think that maybe the best way to phrase it is to say that figuration in painting has been on life support since the second half of the 20th century. How did this happen, and is there hope for the future of figuration? Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Art Thoughts, a series in which I share my ideas and opinion about art and painting. So feel free to leave your contribution in the comments section below and share your own thoughts on this topic. Alright, so is figurative painting as good as dead, or as I said in a provocative manner, on life support? Think about this. The 20th century has seen everything, and I truly mean everything in terms of art. Everything was possible and everything was fair game to count as art. Splashings, monochromes, trash bags, cans of excrement, conceptual art with no physical or material substance, installations, performance, body art, you name it. Anything could be art, except figurative painting, which was considered completely outdated and dusty. If you wanted to be a contemporary painter in this era, you had to find a good excuse. If you wanted to use figuration, it had to be very subversive, intentionally kitsch, politically provocative, or straight up mockery of the very act of painting. There was no other way to paint figuratively as a contemporary painter, if you wanted to be taken seriously at least. My idea is that figurative painting never really died, not really at least. But something was broken at some point, so much so that it appeared to be as good as dead. So let's go back in time and try to understand what happened. The rupture occurred in the 19th century, when artists began to think that it was necessary to paint avec son temps, as the French say, paint with one's own time. The break occurred between the academic painters and the innovators of the time. The realists, the impressionists, those who at the time were rejected. They were rejected from the salons and the most prestigious art institutions for not painting the right way. Strangely, the right way to paint for the advocates of the academic tradition was to paint Greek mythology again and again, which of course is very weird for an era where steam engines and electricity were revolutionizing everything. Some traditionalists insisted that the right way to paint was to follow the old dictates and disregard the modern world, and this was a huge mistake. Those who today regret the death or the near death of traditional painting would be wrong to blame the modernists and the avant-gardes, because they only finished off a dying beast. Painting was already asphyxiated by the very painters who claimed to follow the tradition. They were the real culprits. Academic artists like Cabanel, Couture, Flandrin, Bouguereau. Shortly after this period, people start realizing how irrelevant this type of art was for the 19th century. These painters were called pompiers, which means firemen, as to mock their pompous style, which refers to pompier, and the Greek helmets that they insisted on paintings, which almost looks like the helmets of the firemen at the time. So their mastery, which should have been admired, was completely mocked. Their knowledge, their technique, everything was lost because they didn't know how to use it to paint about their own time. They knew how to paint wonderfully, they had the how, but they didn't know what to paint so that it would resonate with their time, with the people of their time. When asked about the art of his time, Bouguereau was quoted as saying, "A new art? But for what? Art is eternal, and there is only one. Ours is the same as that of all times. We must seek the beautiful and the true, sir." I love Bouguereau's technique, but you have to think about what is true in these rural scenes with folkloric nostalgia. These pastoral scenes What is true in all of this for 19th century people discovering steam engines and electricity? Bouguereau, of course, had a very high sense of the beautiful, but of the true, he only had a very dusty image. Unfortunately, he didn't know how to see beauty hidden in the heart of his time. He never really tried to find new subjects, to use his immense talent. And soon after the innovators took over, he was mocked for being pompous. In the 19th century, Western art experienced two major crises that were intimately correlated: a crisis of representation and a crisis of the subject or subject matter. So not only a crisis of how to paint, but also a crisis of what to paint. Before the 19th century, painting was the only way to represent the appearance of things. The painter's craft was indispensable. It was the age of mimesis. Everything was simple back then. Find any subject, represent objects or characters with good likeness, idealize if necessary, start again. Both representation and subject matter were self-evident at the time. The subject matter of the past was delivered with its aura. It came from history, mythology, or religion. But then something happened, something that would revolutionize the art world. Photography was invented. Of course, it quickly proved to be a much more precise and practical way of capturing and immortalizing the appearance of things. And this was not a sudden break, as actually the technology evolved over several decades, but it fractured very slowly but very surely the function of painting. As photography imposed itself, painters lost the exclusivity of representation. From there, painters had to face a new problem. Why continue to paint? Paint what? The divide spread. What's the point of painting if you can't take a picture? And since then, despite the efforts of artists to reinvent themselves, despite many geniuses, painting has lost its privilege. Faced with this double collapse, both of representation and subject matter, there were various reactions from all artists. Some plead for the complete destruction of art and seek to push art to its limits by making art that has absolutely nothing to do with figurative painting, like installation, body art, land art, everything like this. Other artists use the card of derision. They paint like during the time of the old masters, but they hide behind a thick layer of irony or provocation because they want to be a part of the contemporary game and don't want to be seen as too classical, so they have to be very provocative because this is an excuse to be figurative. Some went for abstract art, sometimes playing with the tenuous line between abstraction and figuration. Some play the pop card, using imagery representative of advertising and mainstream culture. The latest trend in pop art is to make street art, which is the new way of making figurative paintings, but street art is just a subgenre of pop art, so it's nothing really new here. Just another excuse to paint figuratively without admitting it. The stories that used to be represented in paintings are now in what some people wrongly qualify as minor arts. Movies, video games, comics, animation, digital art. The undeniable success of this genre is indicative of the human need for narrative and representation. Figuration still exists, it's just not in paintings anymore. Most painters still refuse to take back their share, as if the invention of abstraction and conceptual art had elevated painting to such a high sphere of elitism that there is no return from it. And here we are today. Painting simply doesn't have to tell a story anymore. So it doesn't speak to anyone, and it's more unpopular than ever. Nothing seems to deserve to be painted, so painters are expected to focus on brushwork and texture. Figurative painters insist on creating drippings and traces of all kind to give something to look at, something interesting. In the end, it's all dry paint. Painters are expected to make paintings about painting. Paintings in which the most important part is that the traces of the brush are visible. Uninteresting jugs, fruits, teapots, trinkets of all sorts become pretexts for painters to play with pseudo-interesting brushstrokes. And that's the only thing we have left. Brushstrokes as subject matter. Splashes as subject matter. Texture as subject matter. Impasto, drippings, dry paint again and again. Only the surface counts, regardless of the narrative void. I don't find that brushstrokes are interesting in themselves. They look nice, but if the subject is boring, if there is no story, the surface quickly becomes boring as well. Anyway, I don't think it matters anymore. The painting doesn't need to make people think, doesn't need to be deep, doesn't need to go any further than the surface. It just needs to be seen. At best, it will decorate a living room, and if the colors match the curtains, it must be a great painting. In the old days, the subject matter was sacred and was calling for its representation. Today, the sacred is dead. Representation survives, but it has never been so poor in subject matter, at least in painting. People have turned to movies and video games to experience intense stories. Painting is no longer popular and only survives in a small cultural and financial elite. Most painters have lost any interest in storytelling. They tend to do what sells, and I can't blame them for that. They tend to focus on the surface, and they don't try to go any deeper. Well, you can't blame them for just painting what sells. At least abstract painters have the decency to admit that they're interested in the surface. No subject, no representation, no story, just brushstrokes, shapes, colors, at least it's clear. Figurative painters who still make jugs and think only of brushstrokes are actually kind of abstract painters who have not yet had the courage to abandon the idea of representation. Yet this is the path that many innovative abstract painters have taken. Kandinsky, Mondrian, Malevich, they all started with representation, but they took it to its ultimate outcome. And this is a stance that must be saluted for its honesty, at least. Without a subject worthy of being seen, without a story worthy of being imagined, the ultimate outcome for representation is to be diluted in abstraction. This is a slap in the face from the avant-gardes from which figurative painters, I think, have never recovered. I know my presentation is kind of hard, but I think that now is the time to recover from the slap in the face. Now is the time for figuration to make its big comeback. All things run in circles, and the wheel has turned for figurative art, in my opinion. I don't want you to think that everything was good before the 19th century and that there is only bad after. To the contrary, the crisis in the representation in the 19th century forced the world of art to go further than simple mimesis, and it's a good thing that it happened. If you love figurative art like I do, you should be thankful for this near-death experience, if I may say. The crisis, which started after the invention of photography, showed that art cannot only be about only imitation. The avant-garde artists of the 20th century have pushed art further than anyone could ever imagine, to the detriment of figuration, which was swept away, broken into pieces because it simply wasn't strong enough at the time. But somehow it survived, broken and devastated, but it survived. It was not mainstream, but some artists kept making figurative painting throughout the 20th century. Some even managed to become extremely famous and respected. In most cases, these Sole survivors of figuration have managed to become widely popular against the currents, both in the elite and in the general population. The appeal for figuration is always there. If you paint something that deserves to be seen, people appreciate it. Everything is a cycle. Soon, the innovations of the past will seem vacuous and repetitive. People and even the elites will grow tired of conceptual art, and figuration will find a way to become relevant again, outside of the sphere of video games and movies. The elites will one day stop trying to find excuses like street art, giant faces, or NFTs to admit that they enjoy figurative works. A movement towards figurative fine arts has already started, so where will it lead us? Just because a movement starts doesn't mean that it's going in the right direction, and doesn't mean that it's going to be relevant. But we have to observe that more and more amazing artists are rediscovering the techniques of the old masters and dare to adopt the pictorial tradition to express today's world. Most of them are not making the same mistakes that the academists like Bouguereau made back in the 19th century, and they accept to paint about their time. Art can't always live in nostalgia. It's okay to look back at the stories of the past because they are timeless, but it should always be reinterpreted to become the stories of today, the stories of the future. This is the only way for figurative painting to be innovative again. The 20th century was the century of excess in art. Everything had to be extreme. Extreme concept, extreme provocation, extreme innovation. And what's left behind is a battlefield in ruins. Figurative painting is all about balance, about slow steps, and about a subtle tension between tradition and innovation. If figurative painting has a destiny for the future of art, it will build up slowly but surely. We'll see what happens in the next decades, but I know that figurative painting has a role to play. Artists just have to claim their due. What do you think? Do you think that figurative painting will have a new renaissance and become relevant again for the mainstream art world? Do you think that it will stay a niche art form reserved for a small number of enthusiasts? Or do you think that it has the potential to become popular again, both for the elites and for the general public? Let me know in the comments section below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you to all my patrons on Patreon. This video wouldn't be possible without the amazing support. If you want to check out my Patreon and be a part of this community, you can find the link in the description box. You'll also find links to my resources for artists and my courses if you're interested in the technical aspects of painting. As always, joy and inspiration to you all. Bye.